Good morning, everybody. I hope you've been listening to our conversation about timbre of voices, and what a delight it is this morning to welcome back Lise Leist and Tom Jones for talk about race in America today. It is St. Mark's Episcopal Church, and it is a beautiful morning. Let us begin with prayer. O God, you made us in your image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infects our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your prayers and purposes on earth, that in your good time all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
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 So for all of you who are streaming with us this morning, welcome and thank you so much for joining us. As you know, if you've been with us before, this is a conversation and we would love to have your input on the conversation. You can type through that email address just off your screen, and it comes to Jill, and Jill will take your thoughts and translate them and bring them to us. So the earlier you get us those thoughts, the easier it is for all of us on this end. So just for those of you who are new, Lise and Tom, you're both very well known in our congregation, but for those of you who do not know them, Lise Leist is a near lifelong educator with particular specialty toward the latter part of your career in equity, inclusion, and diversity work, and now you work for Future 5, which is an incredible organization in Stamford, founded by a member of St. Mark's, shout out to you, Cliff, which is to help kids who really need a hand up, help them to get into college and help them to get into life. Tom, you have an extraordinary story which is memorialized in this memoir, and I've had some more questions about this. This is Thomas W. Jones, From Willard Straight to Wall Street. It is an award-winning memoir, and you can get it through Cornell Press or through Amazon. And again, I recommend this. I've gotten some emails this week that I need to be more articulate about your book. And if sales really go up, I want to cut on these sales here. Okay, Tom. So our conversation, folks, is really about what's happening with race in the world today, and just thought we'd start off with what happened in the past week. So, Lise, any thoughts about what happened during this past week?
Yeah, the word that's come to me this week is solidarity, and I saw that pretty evident with Bubba Wallace and addressing the noose that was found in his shop there, and watching yesterday's race and pre-race where all of the drivers came together in solidarity, and that in itself meant a lot. You know, the Confederate flag, for what it stood for and what it represents, and for someone to have that kind of courage to take that on and have it removed was great. But the solidarity piece really resonated with me. So I would say that was really a kickoff for me this week. But the other piece that hit me hard this week was an interview that I watched with Melanie Hobson, who is an accomplished woman, successful financial advisor and such. And she spoke about how in this country, in these times, that there are only 5 CEOs of color. And that was so disturbing to hear that we haven't, as much as we are coming together, we still have so much to do. But the other piece she spoke about is not being colorblind, that we need to be color brave. If we're colorblind, we're not seeing it. And we want to be seen. We all want to be seen. And that for us to be color brave. And so that held strong with me. And the other piece she spoke about is philanthropy. You know, we've all been to those rubber chicken dinners where we sat down at these round tables and we, made these buys through auctions or donations of such. But have we really done the right thing with philanthropy? Have we really taken the money that we take in and applied it to the resources that are needed? And so it made me question. And I was trying to think of how many folks are out there that are really doing it the right way. And the one that came to mind was Ray Dalio, who is really taking those funds and really creating a different conversation around the culture of giving. Yeah. Because I think when we change that culture of giving, we're really putting in the work that needs to get done. We're using that elbow grease. We're looking at the numbers. Math counts in this piece. We have to really look at the numbers and find out who is really present, who is really going to be a resource to help us. Because a great concern is watching the disparity, the economic gap, and looking at young people who are taking up to 6 years to graduate from college,
right.
Some not finishing, and then graduating with all this debt. So yes, the solidarity, taking a look and getting our houses in order. We've got a lot of clutter in our homes. And if we can rid that clutter to take some advanced steps in understanding, we will have a greater opportunity to be solid in our thoughts. But it's time to kind of declutter, look at our philanthropy, look at the numbers, and see how we can have a better representation of people of color.
Yeah. Oh, wow, beautiful. This is, Tom, something near and dear to your heart right there. You know, a thought?
Well, the news from the week that I would emphasize is a talk I was listening to. It was given by the dean of Yale School of Management.
Yeah.
And the point that he was making was that for black men in this country, in the prime working ages 25 to 54, 30% of black men in that prime working age group are not in the labor force. And this is twice the comparable rate for white men. And he also said that in the next age group down, 18 to 24, there are 6 million black men who have high school diplomas who are neither attending college or employed. So what's happened to this prime working age group is about to happen to another 6 million young black men. To put that in perspective, think of what the economic conditions in white America would be if 30% of prime working age white men were not even in the labor force. Now, we've seen that before. It was called the Great Depression. Mm-hmm. And that was such a stark condition in this country that President Franklin Roosevelt responded with a massive national program. It was called the Works Progress Administration. You know, it was one of the most important New Deal programs, which was to hire these unemployed men. They ultimately hired 8.5 million unemployed men, mostly unskilled laborers, to take jobs mainly doing public works projects. And that continued right up to the beginning of World War II. And my point being that the destruction of black men, the sense of dignity, the sense of self-worth, and the related destruction of the fabric of their families has to be addressed with the same kind of urgency that President Franklin Roosevelt showed in the 1930s when it was an issue facing white men. And so my point would be, you know, America knows how to do this. We've seen this before. We know how to do it. We should have the same kind of federal program to hire these men and give them dignity and give them training and give their families a sense of hope. And the last point would be, you know, so many corporate executives have been speaking out saying that they want to do the right thing. One of the most important right things they could do would be to begin to provide training programs to this cohort of black men that are out of the labor force, and that next group, ages 18 to 24, begin to partner with the government and provide specific training programs that are linked to apprenticeship opportunities to bring these people into the labor force and give them an opportunity for self-respect and dignity.
Oh, thank you to both of you. What a start, right? I always say when I look out at the congregation of people that we have here, and I see those people in our congregation who are unemployed or underemployed, I think that the only thing worse than working is not working.
Right.
I mean, not working is devastating to, we become who we are through that which we do so often. So you work with young kids. You're trying to launch young kids of color, young kids of a mix of racial backgrounds. Any comment on that? As what are these kids feeling? How are you trying to give them a leg up, a push up, a launch up? Any thoughts on that?
And just to go back to Tom's point, about the timeline of this. If you think about Jim Crow, the Jim Crow laws, that was by design. Post-slavery, going to Jim Crow, anything to hold people down, not give them the opportunity to advance. So that sticks in my mind, and it was post-civil rights and Lyndon Johnson that really said, no, we need to stop this. So the cycle, it is a cycle. But when you're working with young people now, well, two things. I think about Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, and she speaks to Tom's point about how we can educate, how we can bring up, and how we can lift up. Because right now, black men that is the greatest population serving time.
Oh, I was about to bring that up when you were done. Absolutely.
And that's that in itself is just keeping it locked, and it's become a business. Prisons have become a big business. So we need to address that piece of it and how we're going to lift folks up. But the other day I had a time to spend with a very close friend, and she shared a story about going to the market where she lives, and that she was in the market and she was backing out of her car, and this man was almost going to back into her. And she put her hands up like, don't back into me, and he didn't, and she pulled off. But when she turned around, she noticed he was black. And then she became fearful because she put her hands up and she said, I don't want this person to think that I'm afraid, or maybe I'm afraid and he's going to come after me. So she drove off, he followed and made the same left-hand turn. And she said for that time, she was so afraid that maybe he was coming after her based on the gesture as being a white female. So there's this umbrella of fear now from white men and women with a male of color. And so I had to speak to her. It's like, I get that, but you acknowledged it. And so when you're talking about working with youth, again, understanding the circumstances that they're in. We spoke about this last week, having a child of color, a son of color. We have different conversations about what you have to do before you go out. It's the same thing working with our youth. We have to tell them every day, your focus right now, your number one job is to go to school. That's your job. That other stuff don't let that other stuff get in your way from getting where you need to go. But there's a lot of fear. And that's one thing that has been a challenge in working with our young people, the fear. They can't get beyond the fear. They want the education, but the fear is huge. And how are we addressing fear?
Wow. Tom, when you think about fears that Lise is describing and people launching, how do you hear the conversation now about this large group of unemployed black men? We have a prison system that it would be an understatement to say it was disproportionately black, and launching into a working life versus when you were launching into a working life, as you were in your memoir launching into a work life during another time of racial struggle. I mean, are these things comparable, or is it a very different world?
Well, the link I would make is, I mentor a number of young people and college people, especially connected with Cornell and Boston University. And one of them contacted me last week, and the conversation went to the crime bill, the 1994 crime bill, and which is kind of blamed for the mass incarceration. And his point being he was condemning certain politicians associated with that. And I said, one thing you should understand is form your opinions with informed understanding of what happened historically. Things aren't always black and white, so to speak, color-driven. And said you should understand that if you saw that picture in 1994 of President Clinton signing the 1994 crime bill, half of the Black Caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus, was lined up behind him waiting for signing pens. And the reason they were lined up behind him waiting for signing pins, and the reason they supported that legislation is because there had been a crack epidemic in the black community starting in the 1970s that was just devastating inner city communities. And so this crackdown on crime, punish crime, was an emotional reaction. I said it was a mistaken policy to not understand what the ramifications would be in terms of how many young black men might get caught up in this system. But I said it was not a racist-driven policy in the sense that only white people wanted to do this to the black community. I said there were as many ill-informed black politicians thinking that this was the right way to go as there were ill-informed white politicians. So let's not make that a racial issue. Let's understand what happened historically. And all that's relevant now is what should we do about it? The mistake should be recognized. Mass incarceration doesn't serve any useful purpose, and we need to give these men, that's one of the reasons why this 30% labor force non-participation rate exists. It's because of men in prison. Young black men in prison, so we need to focus on training these people and giving them an opportunity for redemption and renewal of their lives.
It is big. I mean, my husband is part of a program now with Sing Sing, and one of the things that he's seen and observed is, the lack of education, the lack of resources, and so you're just keeping them there without giving them the resources. They will be there for the rest of their life, but still educate them to a place where they can have a little more dignity. But I think about the narratives, our own narrative, your narrative, Tom's narrative, and you spoke about youth and providing examples. I work with the 100 Black men out of Stanford, and there are some significant players that have similar journeys and similar stories, and Tom mentors his group, and I certainly work with the population of Future 5, but having an opportunity to work with other folks like the 100 Black men has been significant for the students of color to see this is what you can achieve. So giving them better examples of where you can go and not be afraid to share our narratives. And again, to Tom's point, we can't just lay it on one piece. It's not just a black thing or a white thing. It's really looking at the big picture so that you can shape and form your own narrative. I'm proud today to share that my college experience was not what I thought it would be. Going to a single-sex, all-white, very well-to-do, well-heeled college. That was a 2-year college. It now is a 4-year college for students of color. And I have served on that board now for almost 4 years as a vice chair. And now just this week, being invited to sit on the board of trustees for Boston College. I had no idea that the team that I was working with at Pine Manor would say, we want you there, and here's why we want you there. Because we know that you're going to share your story, and you're not going to leave anyone behind. And that's the truth. And if we all do that, we're lifting each other, taking each other with us. So.
Oh, that is just such a great thing to say and such great news. And shout out to Kathleen Corbett, who I know is streaming here today, a former board member at Boston College, and I'm sure she's proud as the peacock, as they say, to hear of your invitation. Yeah, really, really beautiful. So much to say about all of that, but Jill, just want to bring in a question?
Sure, yes. I think that this is a very interesting question, and it kind of speaks to many of the questions we've gotten during this conversation. Have at their root, what can we do, right? So folks in this community always want to be able to do something in response to problems. And so this question, I'm just going to read it. A week or so ago, a black lawyer wrote an article on Medium challenging the concept of white allies in the Black Lives Matter movement. She said that racism is owned by white people, not black people, and that white people can't and shouldn't consider themselves allies in this movement. What would you say about that?
I disagree. To me, the historical truth, I always like to go to historical truth. Let's start with understanding the truth historically. The historical truth is that many Africans were complicit in the slave trade. You know, the truth is, many Africans went out to capture, raid neighboring tribes. That's kind of the tip of the spear, you know, to capture people who were then sold into slavery. So this whole historic, and at the same time, there were many whites who always resisted the slave trade, resisted it when it was legal in Britain, resisted it when it was legal in France, resisted slavery when it was legal in America. So I don't see, to me it's just not useful to frame this whole conversation in white versus black. There have been people of goodwill on both sides of that color divide, and there have been people who are not of goodwill and who have been, frankly, evil on both sides of that color divide. And so I just disagree with the concept that, you know, whites are not important allies in this struggle.
And I think it's language. The language is changing. You know, we spoke a little bit about it earlier. You know, black folks were called colored, we're called Negro. We've been called a lot of names, African American, black. So, you know, I think we have to deal with the language and the language of being a racist and what that means as being a racist. And while we have, many companies have diversity policy statements, putting it out there, but we really need an anti-racist. If we have an anti-racist statement, anti-racist understanding, then I think we're getting away from the black, the white, the Latinx. We're talking about what does it take to not be a racist? So.
I know there's some work being done on that. A professor, maybe from something like Brockport State or something, one of the upstate New York SUNY universities, wrote a book that said something like, titled with How Not to Be Dumb About Race, or something about that. I mean, it was just, let's take a look at that. Yeah. Jill?
Yes, so continuing in that theme of what can we do, this questioner asks, how locally would you two speak about organizations that you would encourage people to get involved with to help here? It's a person who's had great experiences in New York volunteering with organizations. I mean, obviously, Lise, you know one to speak about, but what would be your recommendations for people who want to really activate here?
You want to take that, Tom, first?
I'm not comfortable recommending particular organizations, but I would say that what you can do, you know, is to communicate your feelings on these issues to the leadership of our society, especially elected officials. One of the reasons the mood in the country seems to be shifting, you know, one of the reasons why the national dialogue is shifting is because the opinion polls are showing that for the first time ever, large majorities of white Americans are saying that they believe black Americans have faced police brutality in disproportionate numbers, have faced economic discrimination in, you know, disproportionate terms, and most importantly, they are saying, white America is saying in large majorities that they think these conditions should change. And especially this demonstration of you know, these protests, which have been multicolored and in some cities have been majority or predominantly white, has been a statement by the white community, large elements of the white community saying, we do not want to be racist. And we do not want to be identified with a racist system, and we do not want to be beneficiaries of racism. And so that's an important, really important message. And I would encourage people of goodwill to continue to communicate that whenever and as frequently as you possibly can.
Yeah, I would say the same. I think I want to go back to philanthropy and thinking about what's in your own house. You know, we don't want to just check the box. I'm going to give back my time and do something. We don't want that. We really want to talk about a culture, a sustainable piece. So I would go back to the philanthropy piece. Take a look at what are you doing now? Are they aligned with your mission and vision? Or are they practicing behavior that is contrary to what you're trying to do now?
I'd like to go back to the language about color for a minute.
Yeah.
I made a comment on that. When I was in college in the 60s, the term Negro, coming up to the start of the Civil Rights Movement, the term Negro had been the dominant description for black Americans. In the 60s, I was part of that wave of people who repudiated that term because it was perceived as that's a term that somebody else chose to describe us. And language is important. We should choose our own descriptive terms. And the two descriptive terms that became dominant in the 60s were black and Afro-American. I personally always liked the term Afro-American, again, because it's historically accurate, meaning that we are Americans of African descent. We are of African descent, but we're now Americans. Black is a color, just like white is a color. If we let black and white be the dominant terms in this conversation, whether it's lowercase b or capital B, if B becomes capital B, then lowercase w will become capital W. So you got capital black facing off against capital white. And if you are capital white and I'm capital black, it's emphasizing our differences. If I'm Afro-American and you are Italian-American or Irish-American or German-American, it's describing a historical fact of our heritage. It's also describing our unity as Americans. We once were German, now we're American. So I like the term Afro-American and the analogies that can be applied to all other ethnic groups in this country, but also the language of unity that's implied in that.
That could go way on with language.
Thank you. Let's say a little bit more. This is a
really interesting.
really
with
fascinating topic.
The name, because now you're talking about multiracial children and how do they identify and where do they fit in. So you can, I think about my daughter's experience with applying to University of Virginia, and there were only 2 boxes to check. Right. You were either black or you're white. There wasn't anything, and there wasn't even an other box. And so she said, what do I do? Which box do I check?
That's hard to believe.
Did she create her own little box and right in the middle?
I said, check the black box. That's what I said. They got enough white kids, check the black box. I mean, so, and whether it made a difference or not, but that's the struggle that multiracial children have to deal with. There isn't a box to check.
Right.
And, my father was Asian and my mom is black, I always check the black box. So when you're thinking about language and how we look at each other, what box do you check? And so for that person who's looking for how he or she can get out there, it's looking at all the boxes, examining their self, and examining what's going on in their own home. Yeah.
Books is such a fascinating conversation. I know that in the article I read the other day on whether or not to capitalize B or to have small b on black, the black African-American writers for the New York Times were not in agreement.
Right.
They were split nearly 50-50 on this to say what's at stake. I find it very interesting in my household where all of my kids listen to rap music. I mean, I think Father Justin is listening to symphonies and I'm listening to Lil Wayne and early Jay-Z in my household. And one of the things, I know a lot about rap, that would be a really fun conversation, but one of the things that I pointed out at our dinner table is the N-word is sung in our household maybe as many as 200 times a day, where none of us in our household would dare use such a word. But I mean, if you drive by the rectory, I mean, you know, you hear this stuff coming out the windows, and you know how black culture has taken that negative word and turned it into, you know, a positive word. And then I said to my kids, the white culture has no equivalent word. We have no historical word that has the power of the way that these rappers are using this word. And I know it's complicated in the black community too. I don't mean that the way the rap community uses it would be appropriate for or enjoyed by the whole of the black community.
Right, certainly not.
Certainly not.
Yeah, right.
No.
Yeah.
Not in my house.
Right.
Yeah. So it's what a fascinating time as we move forward. I mean, so we're talking about moving forward with language.
Yeah.
We're talking about, you know, these are the cultural underpinnings, as you were saying. One of the things that needs to change is not just legislation, but culture.
The most I can say for the rappers is that the pejorative N-word is spelled N-I-G-G-E-R.
Right.
That's the pejorative word. The way the rappers did it is N-I-G-G-A. So they are saying we're creating a new, this is not that guy,
it's
the pejorative.
Right.
This is, you know, a new person. So, you know, I'm not a fan, but you know,
It is, yeah, it's true.
I understand.
Yes, and it's really, really fascinating. I wonder, one of the things, I mean, there are so many, as we were saying earlier, I think it's an incredibly exciting time to be alive, which is what I'm going to say in my sermon. Actually going to talk about a lot of what we're talking about today in my sermon. One of the things that I'm shocked by, and I'm shocked by many things, is that the book White Fragility is sold out. And that white America has awakened to something and now wants to have an increased sensibility about what it means to be white, the ease with which it means versus what it means to be black or multiracial in our world, and why it is that we as white people have not wanted to talk about it. And you have any thoughts about white fragility and why this book is suddenly the white community wants to read it?
I think there's a sellout of most of these books now. I think there's a cry for help. You know, I don't want to be the one accused of not knowing what to do. And I think white fragility was probably very safe. You know, I am fragile at this time. I am white. How can I be a better person? I don't want to be labeled as being a bad person. And that I spoke earlier about conversations, dinner conversations. I've happened to go out twice, and it's interesting. The conversations around the tables now are really more about what's going on and how can I be better. So it's a good thing. I just hope it sustains. I hope we don't feel like I've done this for a while and I'm going to stop. But I will say in the same breath, doing this work and having these conversations, it can make you very weary and tired. And diversity work it will overtax you. You'll get tired of doing it. And when you feel tired, pull away. Pull away and take a break and do some reflection and figure out, okay, I've only taken so much in right now. That book is not going to cure you. That book is just going to help you start. The journey is a lifetime journey on how you can address on how not to be a racist and not to be so fragile. We're all fragile right now. So, you know, I'm not surprised that it's sold out. There's a lot of books. The children's books are sold out. That to me was inspiring because I was looking to buy children's books, and to see those gone made me feel like, okay, parents are beginning to realize I have to do a better job. I have to do it. So I'm happy to see different contexts that are coming out to give people more of an awareness, having the courage to read it. I mean, we have our courageous conversations here, and we had all of our books displayed here, and Kyle Peterson had brought all these books to share, and to watch our congregants pick up a book and say, maybe I should take a look at this. It's inspiring.
I think it's wonderful
Yeah.
that this conversation is occurring in the country,
Yeah.
and there's, you know, that this literature is being sold in huge, huge quantities, because the story of the history of what's happened to different groups, it's not just, you know, bad things happen to black people. Bad things happen to Chinese people, and bad things. I mean, America's got a very
A tattered history.
It's a tattered history. And we historically tend to cover over all of that and not talk about it. And I think it's good for Americans to try to educate themselves and become more familiar with the true story of this country, I think at the end of the day, we're going to, the space we have to find is that despite all of the ugly events that have occurred, the ideals of America are still the best ever articulated for any people anywhere around the world to be self-governing. And secondly, that the only road that's ultimately going to work is a road that is not about emphasizing our racial differences. It's a road that's going to be about emphasizing shared values and shared moralities. It's the same reason why, it's the Christian example. It's ultimately going to be, unity and love that's going to be the road that works.
Right. Amen. Yeah, I think of that, and I think of how do we create character, sustain character, to have good character, and to understand that with empathy. And it is a road, a long road, but it's a good road.
Yeah, it's a life road.
Right.
It's a life road.
I wonder if this writer is asking if you would touch on the topic of access to better education as a catalyst for equalizing opportunity.
So it's interesting to watch what's going on in higher ed. I can speak to, there are colleges now that are speaking out about higher education for first-generation students, and that they are taking a united stand on creating student success programs. So what they're doing is putting in place game plan coaches of such in these higher ed institutions to support students that are coming in. So the example I used with Pine Manor is that a lot of the students that come in just don't have the skill set to really manage a Boston College piece. And so the goal now is to really create a program and taking in students who need that gap 2 years or so, so that they can move on into these institutions. The group that I work with now, I tell them that their calling card is their GPA. That is your job, is to have a decent GPA, good board scores, that puts you in line for other colleges to come to you and give you the money that you need to get there. It's sad to see these students of color that have come through high schools and getting into these great schools, but walking out with so much debt. So we have set them, we haven't advanced them. We've set them up to fail and not to be economically successful. So the more that higher ed can take a look at what they want and filtering it down so that we're bringing students through and partnering, I think that will certainly have a different effect on the young people that are coming out from college.
This is a point I touched on in our first conversation the first week. I think educational equality of opportunity is one of the most critical issues to address. I mean, right now, communities like New Canaan have very successful people clustered together where we invest hugely in our educational system. I mean, that's the predominant portion of New Canaan's budget. That's what the town does. That's basically what the town is selling, the quality of public education. And we spend whatever the number is, $25,000 or whatever the number might be per capita, with all kinds of not just educational programs, not just classroom, but very importantly, orchestra and drama and sports and clubs. It's all opportunities for a young person to find themselves, Not everybody finds it in the classroom doing algebra, but you just need to find something that brings out the best in you and that you can excel at, and then learn the discipline of success. True. And we cluster together and we create these communities, and we then train these kids to excel at things like the SAT exams, and we train them to excel at the other things that we then define as meritocracy. Okay? We train our kids to excel at exams and excel in the classroom, and we then because of our legacies, because of where we went to school, because most of us came from families that were similarly successful, we then use our legacy advantages, our legacy, relationships to get them into the top tier of the higher education system around the country, into the Ivy League schools and the comparable schools like Boston College. And then we know that the top tier of corporate America only goes recruiting at certain colleges. The top companies in America don't go around to, all 5,000 colleges or whatever the number is of colleges in the country. And so this whole system works together. It's like a pipeline from, New Canaan to the top tier of corporate America, for those kids who have the discipline and the stamina and the desire to do it. And we define that as meritocracy. And, the kid that lives 20 miles from here in Bridgeport has no such pipeline.
Right.
It doesn't work that way. And it starts with the resources that are in his school system. The quality of teachers that are available to him, the quality of instruction that are available to those kids, the quality of after-school activities to bring out the best that those kids have and help them find themselves. And so this is, a fundamental issue. My recommendation, what I mentioned in the first week, was that I believe that educational funding has to be federalized. It can't be based on local property taxes. And that the parents, low-income parents, need to be empowered by having a voucher which enables them to spend the same dollars to educate their child as a parent in New Canaan can spend to educate their child. I would not turn over this money to the public education bureaucracy. I would empower the parent to say, I'm going to find a school system that excels in bringing out the best for my child. And if we empower these parents to have their kids receive first-class educations, and we fund that at the federal level, I think we'll see significant improvement.
And I would just say that, to make parents feel like they can be partners. Parents want the best, all parents want the best for their children, but having it be more inclusive and welcoming for parents.
That was such a fulsome answer. It's incredible. Wow.
So one more question, a little bit different direction. This person writes, I was recently reading the classification of 2 software companies as having achieved the ESG principles for diversity and inclusion, that's environmental, social, and governance, because they've outsourced many of their employee base to international and foreign shores. I think this misses the point about the goal of diversity and inclusion in U.S. companies. What would you say about that, and how can we better educate investors on how diversity and inclusion is measured as a part of the kind of ESG investing model?
Ooh. I've heard this question before.
I think it's a total distortion of
Yeah.
what diversity and inclusion is supposed to mean.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that you outsource your engineering or your call center to India, or to the Philippines. It's diversity and inclusion within the context of America.
Right. And global. Yeah.
Wow, I tell you, I just love Sunday mornings with you too. I really do, and I'm actually kind of sad we're drawing to a close, and I mean that. It was something that my wife Jennifer said to me this morning. She goes, I know you love these conversations, and I do, and I know that so many others of you out there love these conversations. And just a word or two. So what we have done these last 4 Sundays with you, Tom, and the last 2 with you, Lise, there is a video log with you and an interview, which I said has done tremendously well in the world, which is really fun. And now, I don't know if you had a chance to see the conversation with Syra Borsi that Syra and I had last week. The conversation around race in our country today is a conversation that most assuredly we're going to pick back up in the fall in some form or fashion, and that's work that we will do along with Kyle to put our heads back together about what we might do. We're moving toward summertime, right? And the primary piece of business of any church is to gather for the worship of God. And so, as many of you know, next week during the 9 o'clock hour, we're going to be gathered outside for Holy Communion. For those of you who are part of the faithful here at St. Mark's, and I invite everybody to be part of that faithful, you can get on our website this week and sign up through what we call Realm. Sign up so that you can come and be a part of our Holy Communion next week at 9 o'clock. But as the bell tolls, I want to say that bell also calls out in grateful thanksgiving to you too. I mean, you are our teachers, and you are our communal love too. And to have you give voice to your experience has been just a life-giving line for all of us who've been on the receiving end. So a grateful thanksgiving to each of you, and blessings upon your household and your kids' households to the degree that your kids are not living at home under your roof because of the weird circumstances of COVID-19. So God bless you. God bless everybody out there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And the conversation will continue in a new form on another day. Peace and blessings.
Thanks, Peter.
Peace be with you.
Yeah, bye-bye.